Dorado of Death by Percy B. From Weird Tales, July 1927. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Dale Grothman. A story of the Australian gold diggings. The El Dorado of Death by Percy B. The brothers Wakeford worked together in a South Australian chemical factory. There was a strong bond of sympathy between them. They were inseparable pals. Both of an adventurous disposition, they chafed at the restrictions of city life and constantly planned to go prospecting. Like all young men, and not a few elderly ones, they dreamed of earning easy money. Working merely in order to make a bare living did not coincide with their ideas of what life was meant for. We have all of us, at some time or other, experienced this feeling. One evening, while they were drinking together, they fell into conversation with a bearded man, bronzed and weather-beaten, gaunt and keen-eyed. They thought at first that he was merely one of those pests, always to be found hanging around hotels, but were not long in discovering their error. Many of his reminiscences were concerned with prospecting. He had sought out gold along the banks of creeks, in lonely bush gullies, and many were the stories he told the two Wakefords of perils and hardships, of occurrences, grim, some of them, others ludicrous, that by turns had gladdened and saddened his adventurous wanderings. Warmed by their hospitality, the old bushman told them, among other places, of a valley in the McDonald Range, and of a thin wisp of a stream that meandered through it, in the dry bed of which, near a certain gnarled and aged tree, gold dust, plenty of it, glittered in the sand, and could be scooped up by the handfuls. In proof that his story was not an hallucination, he showed the brothers a small quantity of the precious metal in a tobacco tin, and also gave them a plan of the gully roughly scrawled on a scrap of paper, with full directions for reaching it. They were astonished that he made no endeavor to sell them his secret, instead of divulging it gratuitously. His explanation, however, seemed reasonable enough. He had for years, he said, been a martyr to rheumatism, but, hopeful of shaking it off sufficiently to go gold hunting again, he had never mentioned the gully or its aquiferous base bed to a living soul. Alone in the world, and no longer hopeful of recovery, he saw no reason why its whereabouts should remain secret. Their meeting with the old prospector inflamed imaginations and roused dormant aspirations. Suddenly deciding to throw off their shackles, they left their chemical factory, and purchasing a tent, blankets, and other equipment, set out in search of their El Dorado. They could not have selected a more inopportune time to begin their quest. The heat that summer was phenomenal. Unused to hardships that would have tried the stoicism of hardened bushmen, the brothers Wakeford trudged onward with their heavy packs, the sun blazing fiercely down upon them. Their feet, which had never previously been called upon to carry them as far in a week as now, tramping from dawn till dark with heavy Blucher boots. They were compelled to travel every day, became blistered and raw. Insects of many kinds, some of them poisonous, bit and stung the two men with persistency. At last the younger brother, half crazed with the heat and parched with thirst, became too ill to proceed further, and a camp was made in a dreary and lonely spot, beside a stagnant pool, in a forest of dead and gaunt gum trees that raised bleached branches as though in supplication to the relentless and white-hot sky. A more appropriate scene of tragedy, indeed, could scarcely be imagined. A thunderstorm, at first muffled and far away, crept ever closer and finally crashed above the tent of the two unfortunates, who, weakened by privation and comatose with fatigue and despair, huddled inside it. The storm intensified the desolation, the melancholy, and the loneliness, filling them with a sense of foreboding as though of some impending calamity. The younger Wakeford's sufferings, in particular, were intense, much more so than those of his brother, for, beside being weak and light-headed for want of proper nourishment, and as a result of exposure to the pitiless sun, he was a nerve-racked and undervitalized fellow, moody and imaginative. Night, illuminated by flashes of lightning and made hideous by the cannonade of warring clouds, closed round the desperate wayfarers. Despite the uproar, aches and pains, and a strained and overwrought state of mind by reason of which he was on the verge of hysteria, the younger Wakeford controlled himself by an effort of will, determined to await, resolute and alert, the issue of events which he somehow felt, without knowing how or why, were impending. The elder brother, overcome by weariness, fell into a deep and dreamless slumber. Wakeford, the younger, was aroused toward midnight from a reverie of feeling that someone or something had entered the tent. Raising his eyes, he beheld, bending over him, a tall figure in white, which signaled to him to follow. He rose immediately, and the white-robed figure leading the way, they began to traverse a succession of damp and dark corridors, seemingly endless, until they reached at last an enormous cavern filled with a moon-like radiance, where dancing was in progress. Strains of weird music were pierced by continuous strange and staccato clicking sounds, like the turbulence of castanets. Bewildered and dazed by the sudden transition from darkness and desolation to the glittering and crowded hall of festivities, it was some moments before Wakeford the younger was able to comprehend in its entirety what was going on. When he did so, he was chilled to the bone with horror, for the white-robed figures, gliding hither and thither across the crystal floor, were skeletons, and the curious and continuous staccato sound which resembled castanets was the clicking of their fleshless jaws. The music ceased, and the couples separated, seating themselves upon benches of iridescent stalactites ranging round the walls. Then, after a brief interval of awful and unbroken silence, the invisible musicians commenced again, and the skeletons, to a different rhythm this time, began once more to glide around the cavern floor. Young Wakeford was petrified with terror. The white-robed figure he had followed into the cavern seemed taller than any of the others, and to be in a position of command. It now ordered him, by signs, to select a partner for the next dance from the hideous throng surrounding him. Horrified, he shrank from it, tried to run, but, held by some strange power, was unable to move from where he stood. Irritated, the tall figure turned upon him threateningly, raising its arms to strike. Quick as thought, young Wakeford, whose legs alone seemed stricken and paralyzed, pulled a revolver from his holster, and leveling it at the tall and ghostly spectre, pulled the trigger. With the shock of the report, the dreadful dream was shattered. The cavern with its ghostly radiance, its fearsome and ghastly dancers, and the threatening spectre, all had vanished. Wakeford the younger was back in the tent again, staring dumbfounded at his elder brother, who lay bleeding from a bullet wound in the chest, and gasping out his life. Scarcely had the elder Wakefield breathed his last before another shot rang out. The two brothers ended the journey as they had begun it, together. The end of The El Dorado of Death by Percy B. Pryor.
Spooky Ventures is the home for spooky content and spooky merchandise on the web. Check it out today at spookyventures.com. And remember, always keep it spooky.